Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this LMS webinar on why remote leadership is different and why it's not, in partnership with Vardo, who is a leading supplier in off-the-shelf e-learning courseware. In this webinar, we will be looking at what organisations need to consider to develop leaders that work remotely with teams spread across different geographies, time zones, and sometimes countries, and why this is important to ensure business success. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker for this afternoon, Wayne Turmel. Wayne is a co-founder of the Remote Leadership Institute and founder and president of GreatWebMeetings.com. For 20 years, he's been obsessed with helping managers communicate more effectively with their teams, bosses, and customers. He is the author of several books that demystify communicating through technology, including Meet Like You Mean It, A Leader's Guide to Painless and Productive Virtual Meetings, 10 Steps to Successful Virtual Presentations, and 6 Weeks to a Great Webinar. His work appears frequently in managementissues.com, and Marshall Goldsmith calls him one of the unique voices to listen to in the virtual workplace. He works with organisations around the world to help people use technology to lead people and projects and build productive human connections in an increasingly remote work environment. Now I will pass you over to Wayne, who will be hosting the rest of the session.
Thank you. I'm always amazed when I hear my introduction. I go, wow, this guy's really impressive, and then I realize it's just me. But welcome, everybody. I hope that you are well this afternoon. It is early morning here in the U.S., and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about why remote leadership is different, and maybe most importantly, why it's not, and how that impacts those of us responsible for developing the leadership capabilities and organizations. Specifically for the next little bit, we're going to talk about why leading remotely matters. What is the business case, if you will, for making sure that we understand the dynamics that our people are working with and why it matters from a business sense. We're also going to talk about, and this is something that frequently gets ignored when we're talking about remote and virtual teamwork, what hasn't changed? What has remained the same over all these years? And then, of course, how is leading remotely different? And then we're going to wrap this up with what organizations, and whether you use a Z, a Z, or an S, depends, I guess, on which country you're from, what they need to consider to develop leaders. And, of course, that's why we're here in partnership with Vardo. So that is my agenda for today. What I really, really want, though, is for you to get your questions in. As we talk about certain subjects, if a question occurs to you, please get it in queue. I would much rather that this be very informal and answer your specific questions so that you feel like this is the best use of your time. So why do good working relationships matter? And this is a really important question. You know, there's some serious money on the line here, as well as the sanity of human beings. We know that our workplace has differed. I mean, if we just look at this, I am a Canadian living in the U.S. on a UK webinar for a company with a French name. That's just a very simple example of how the world is shifting under us. And there are some major statistics. 90% of major projects involve remote team members, whether completely remote and virtual or co-located with a few members elsewhere. And remember that 2/3 of capital expenditures are on projects. So 90% of that 2/3 of money involves the effective use of remote teams and workers. 75% of managers above first-line supervisors have at least one remote team member, and 67, 69% of managers are members of a remote team ourselves. And as telecommuting increases, as the number of people who work remotely, in the U.S., approximately 25% of the workforce now is part-time, temporary, or contract employees. So the situation isn't going in reverse anytime soon. So as we're thinking about all these changes and how crazy it's making us and why the world is spinning, feeling like it's out of control, it's important to take a step back and think about what hasn't changed in all this time. And the great management thinker Peter Drucker once said that we get ourselves kind of in a tizzy, but the truth of the matter is that leadership and management hasn't changed in a long time. The greatest management job of all time was building the Great Pyramids, and we've just been trying that ever since. And that's certainly true. On the other hand, at least the guy who built the pyramids was at the pyramids. He wasn't trying to flog the workers by email. And, Genghis Khan ruled half the known world and never held a webinar. So, things have changed, and yet they haven't. For purposes of this discussion, there are a couple of models that I want us to think about. The first one is one that we at the Remote Leadership Institute have come up with, and it's really simple, but I think it's an important filter through which we should think about this subject. If you think about remote leadership and you think about the machine and all the cogs working in sync with each other, our attitude is that the largest piece of this, the leadership and management behaviors that human beings need in order to get the work done, frankly, haven't changed. This is the work that Drucker was talking about, the coaching, the setting the corporate vision, the communicating, the finding resources for people. All of that remains exactly the same. What has changed and why leading remote teams and leading people remotely feels like an entirely different animal is that we're doing it mediated by tools and technology in ways that the world has literally never seen before. I can remember, I've got enough snow on the roof that when I joined my first corporate job and got my first email account, people still predominantly used computers at work. The home computer was still something of a novelty, and we didn't have our own email addresses, and all of that, of course, changed very rapidly. Well then, somebody's put us on hold. If you could manage not to do that, that would be lovely. I have no idea what's going on there, but we will find out. And in the meantime, we're just going to continue. So when we're talking about leadership, we're really talking about things that are evergreen. And so my partner in the Remote Leadership Institute, Kevin Eikenberry, wrote a really excellent book called Remarkable Leadership. If you haven't had the chance to check it out, not a bad thing to do. And it really specifies that, we're looking at a number of leadership competencies, and I'm not going to go through all these. So now all of a sudden, here we are, right? Look at all the things that we have to do as leaders. We need to champion change. We need to communicate powerfully. We need to build relationships and manage projects and processes and all sorts of madness. And none of that has changed as a result of working remotely. And yet the role of the leader is really critical because performance consultants agree that fewer than 10% of problems are due to a lack of capability on the part of the worker. They can do it. The question is, do they know how? Are they being given the guidance? And that's really, really critical. And when we're working remotely, it's important to remember that that is part of a larger system, and those of you familiar with Deming will certainly understand. Now, the concept of management by walking around has been around a long time. I remember doing a presentation at Hewlett-Packard where the concept was kind of invented, and one of the VPs came down and was giving kind of holding forth on the notion that managers need to get away from their desk and management by walking around and all of that good stuff. And yet, one of the guys turned to the other and said, yeah, but it's a long walk to Bangalore, pal. And that's the truth of the matter. We are, in fact, in a very different world. So why is it different? Well, this is the second model of the three that I really want to focus on. And it's the idea of building trust. How do we do it? And whether we are co-located, whether it's you and I working together in the same location or working on opposite ends of the earth, teams build trust in the exact same way. The first is through common purpose, the notion that we are all in it together for the same reasons, trying to achieve the same things. And I would say that of the three things in this model, this is the one that we do best. If you think about project management processes, for example, it always starts with what is it we're trying to do, the team charter, the purpose. As we work remotely, though, and especially as we work virtually, and by virtually I mean that we may all be part of the same project team. If you folks will excuse me for a moment, I know what the problem is here, and I'm going to get rid of it. So hang on one moment, and I am going to apologize profusely. There we go, and now I think we've solved the problem. So the idea of us working together remotely for a common purpose is really critical, but none of that happens unless we also have proof of competence, unless we can show that the person we're working with is as good at their job as I am. And at work, we see it every day. You know who comes in early, you know who stays late, you know who the go-to person is to answer a specific question. When we're working virtually, we don't see that as often. And if the only time I hear from Patty is when something goes wrong, I'm going to draw some conclusions about Patty's competence. If the only time Rajesh speaks up on a conference call is, to say hello and I never hear from him again, I have no sample size from which to draw an accurate picture of his competence. So when we're working remotely, we work from very small sample size, and the same is true of motives. How do I know that the person that I'm working with is working as hard, has my back, is willing to go out of their way to help me? Unless I see it, I don't know it. And this creates a real challenge. And those of us developing leaders know that when we work remotely, some of the common challenges are things like an overdependence on the leader. CCing on emails, for example, is a very common sign of a lack of trust. When we assess teams in our work at Great Web Meetings, what we often find is the relationship between the leader and the individual team members can be terrific, but the relationships between the team members themselves are not nearly what they should be. And it comes from not really believing that everybody has the same purpose, not believing that the other team members are as competent as they are, or if they are competent, that they care as much and they're working as hard. So that's the situation there. What builds working relationships? Well, we know it happens over time, right? We need to develop a shorthand with each other, if you will. So we need to see evidence of motives, evidence of competence. We need to work together to develop that social shorthand that allows us, and that frankly happens organically when we're co-located. When you grab a cup of tea in the break room, when you sit before a meeting and have the chit-chat that co-workers have, it actually builds relationship networks. When we're not doing that consciously, we're actually shortchanging our team. So if we go back to this model, this idea of that the leadership behaviors are the same and we're trying to do it through tools and technology that we've never done before. And this third model, which we didn't really discuss, which is you've got the technology, do you know how to use it? One of the interesting studies that came from a Human Resources Association in the UK actually is that 80% of managers say that tools like GoToMeeting and Microsoft Lync and WebEx are mission critical, and yet only 10% felt that they were competent and confident that they used the tools effectively. Think about that for a moment from an investment standpoint, from a productivity standpoint. You've got something that is absolutely mission critical, and yet we don't use it very well. Choosing the right tools is absolutely paramount, and I'm not a big fan of any particular tool. Today we're using GoToWebinar. Whether you use WebEx or Instant Messenger or Microsoft Lync, which overnight became Skype for Business, it's less about what tool you use than are you using it appropriately and are you using it effectively. And so we come to the third model that I really want to make sure that we are aware of today, and that is when we are choosing the technology, when we are choosing a tool, how do we choose the right tool for the job, right? How do we know when do we pick up the telephone? When will an email suffice? When should I use my webcam? When should I share my screen in a web meeting? And it comes down to some research that a German researcher named Bettina Buchel came up with. And it's the concept of richness versus scope. So very simply, what does that mean? Well, first, when we're talking about richness, we're talking about getting those multiple communication cues in real time that we're all familiar with. Having a cup of coffee together is an incredibly rich experience. Not only are we speaking to each other in real time, it's an informal situation, we can ask questions, but we're looking in each other's eyes, we're hearing the tone of voice, we're seeing the body language, so that when I say, do you understand? And you say, yeah, I know that you don't really have a clue and you're just saying that to get rid of me. That's richness. The problem with richness, of course, is that it suffers with the number of people. We all know as we add people to a meeting, things become more formal. People tend not to ask questions as readily. And you know, that's a real challenge. And of course, in a world where we may not physically be together and there's no opportunity for that to happen, richness definitely suffers. Now, one of the ways we're trying to enhance richness on this call is make it interactive. So I'm urging you to, as we're going, please get your questions in queue, because I'd love to have the chance to talk further about some of this. But that's richness. So are we having as rich a conversation as possible? And when we're talking about coaching employees, for example, how do we make that rich? You know, obviously an email isn't going to have the same impact as sitting knee to knee across a table. But there is the matter of scope. We are separated by time and distance. We do have multiple people that we have to communicate. So email, for example, is an excellent example of scope. It allows us to give many people the same message at the same time. Speed matters, right? When there's nothing faster than sending out a blanket email, and it covers time spent, space, and dimension in the sense that there becomes a permanent record. So that really starts to matter. So if we look at this matrix, and on one end, you know, we're very high in richness, face-to-face communication. Individual phone calls, for example, are still very rich. They're real-time. They're one-on-one. You can hear the tone. On the other end are emails, and those of us who have ever spent 3 days apologizing for an email that it took 30 seconds to send appreciates the fact that it lacks some nuance, that you can't ask questions in real time. It's not a synchronous tool. And so what we have at our disposal is a mix of tools, both synchronous and asynchronous, which allow us then to fill in the blanks. Let's take a simple example. Conference calls, for example, teleconferences, we're all familiar with them. We've all seen the YouTube video about why they're horrific. But what's the real problem? You can't see each other. Certain people dominate because they're willing to speak up. Certain people aren't. But if you take a look at a web meeting, it actually can be a richer experience than that. When you add the visual component, when everybody is looking at the same thing. For example, if we were doing this on the telephone and I had just sent you the PowerPoint slides in advance, you might be looking at them, you might not. You might be looking on the same page as me, you might not. In this case, it's a little bit richer because we're all looking at the same visual. I'm using the annotation tools to draw your eye to a specific point. So in this case, a web meeting is a richer experience than perhaps simply a teleconference, but not as rich as being face-to-face. Now, we have a question in queue, which is really terrific, which is, can trust be implied at the start of a virtual relationship? And I think, it's funny, I wrote an article years ago on management issues about the difference between faith and trust. And trust is evidence-based, whereas faith is intention-based. So I think we start with the faith that everybody is equally motivated. You want, it's certainly if everybody admits that they're on the same page, if we can at least assess that we're all going for the same common purpose, it's fairly easy to start that way. The problem is that over time, that trust is very, very easily broken, whereas it needs to be bolstered by evidence. So let's take a look at how richness versus scope plays into that. You know, if the only thing I know about Lucy from Lumess, she seems like a nice enough person. Her emails are always very kind of bland, but I've never heard her speak. I've never seen her face. I know nothing about her, and she certainly knows nothing about me. It wouldn't take very long for me to annoy her. I tend to be kind of a smart aleck. My tone is very light. I don't take any, I take things seriously, but I don't take them gravely. And so, you know, my responses sometimes come off as a bit flippant. If the only way she knows me, she can't hear my tone of voice, she's never seen my smiling face, that might undermine the trust. Well, Wayne is a bit of a flake, and, you know, frankly, he's kind of annoying. If the only interaction we have is blanket email, you have that problem. A friend of mine at DePaul University here in Chicago did a study and found that when you cannot put a face to a name, when the only relationships you have with someone are faceless and virtual, there's actually an increase in negative behaviors. Withholding information, lying, bullying, if you will, because they're not a real person, right? Human beings build relationships very much visually, and without some kind of visual component to add richness to the communication, it becomes very transactional. So this idea of richness versus scope is really critical. For remote leaders, since the only way that we can see proof of purpose, proof of competence, proof of motives is virtually mediated by technology, are we making the most of the tools at our disposal? And again, thank you for that question, Lawrence, and I would love to get more questions in queue. In the meantime, so why don't people adopt technology if it's so helpful and it's so wonderful, and by golly, we all should use it? And it's kind of very often attributed to fear. And the fact of the matter is people don't fear technology. We wouldn't be here if they did. And we all use technology every day. I'm always amused. People say, oh, you know, the people on my team won't use their webcams. Okay, that's fair enough. Why not? Well, they're kind of technophobic. And yet, if they have grandchildren in another part of the country, they're on Skype every weekend. You know, the technology in our telephones has more computing power than it took to put a man on the moon in the 1960s. We don't fear technology, but when you reach a certain age, you become very skeptical. We've all been through the wars of we're going to roll out a great tool and it doesn't do the job or something happens. The fact of the matter is, I believe that for most people, it's not so much fear as it is we're too darn busy and we don't see the return on investment for investing the time to learn and use another tool. It takes time to use something different. Some interesting statistics, and we'll take web meetings because that's where in my book I've spent so much time doing the research on this. I'm kind of geeking out about it, but 80% of people who use tools such as WebEx or Microsoft Lync receive no training or coaching before they use it. Here's your WebEx license, try not to hurt someone. Hi, Mr. Project Manager, here's a tool that is mission critical to you, I'm sure you'll figure it out. And as a result, we get some interesting things. 2/3 of online meeting time is considered wasted. And more importantly, I think 80% of people use only 20% of the features of the tools. So if you think about the interactivity that's inherent in a tool like WebEx or Adobe Connect or Microsoft Lync, if you're not using those tools, you may as well not have them. You can enhance richness by using webcams, by creating whiteboards and using that as a way to generate discussion and hear from everybody. Very frequently, one of the first things people do on web meetings is turn off the chat because it's a distraction. And yet, it can be one of the most powerful tools for relationship building, for getting input. Think about international teams, for example. People with English as a second language frequently have better written English skills than spoken English skills, and yet if you turn off the chat in a web meeting, you're limiting the opportunity to hear from people and restricting them to the method that they are least happy with. So as the people responsible for developing the skills, and certainly as we were looking at taking the various knowledge components for the e-learning that we're talking about here, there were 3 fundamental questions that I think meeting organization leaders need to ask themselves. The first is, do your remote leaders know what's expected of them and can they do it? So if we go back to the management behaviors, this goes back to first purposes, right? Do they even know that? It's so funny. People talk about virtual leadership as if it's a different animal. But one of the really important questions is, how are they doing anyway? How are your co-located leaders doing? It's not like we were doing such a brilliant job before and, oh yeah, now everything's changed. Leadership has always been tough, and so we need to develop those leadership skills. As an organization, have you identified what those skills are? Are you properly preparing your folks to have them, and how are you developing them in the organization? And how do you know whether or not they can do it? The second thing is, can they then choose the right technology to communicate effectively? Can they explicitly tell you, when do I send an email? When do I pick up the phone? When do I get on a plane? When does firing up a webcam help? And if you look at how these two fit together, let's take coaching conversations. Coaching conversations, for example, we know need to be extremely rich. They need to be two-way. There's a lot of nonverbal communication that goes on. So you need to have the skills, and they are certainly teachable, and we certainly have a model at Remote Leadership that we use for coaching people that is applicable whether you're co-located or not. But when you're co-located, you're getting the benefit of all this extra information. When you are not co-located, when you are mediated by technology, how are your listening skills? Are you asking good questions? Are you truly letting people tell you what they think? And what are the tools that can help you do that? So you may not be crazy about webcams. Frankly, I'm not crazy about webcams. I actually have a rule with my clients in the UK, no webcams before 6 a.m. without lots and lots of notice. Because nobody needs to see what I look like at 6 a.m., frankly. But there are times when the webcam might be the right thing to do. But on what are you basing that decision? And for most people, it's what we're comfortable with. So you have some managers who are over-reliant on the telephone. Some managers do everything by email. And none of those tools is wrong in and of themselves, but they may not be used correctly. They may not be the right tool for the right job. And then if you are going to use web meetings or virtual communication tools or whatever else you're going to use, can you actually use those tools at an effective level? If WebEx or Microsoft Lync or whatever the tool is going to be part of your manager's toolkit, do people know how to use it well? So there's that little development piece as well. And so, you know, I see that we have a couple of more questions in queue, and I'm delighted to take those. Frankly, I'd rather get to those. So why don't we do this? Whoops, get back there. We'll take a couple of questions in queue, and in the meantime, for those of you who are interested in more information about Remarkable Leadership, about the Remarkable Leadership Institute, Remote Leadership Institute, and there's a video tutorial from Kevin Eikenberry and myself. In the meantime, Lucy, I'm going to take a look at the question here. Does it help, if possible, to have some face-to-face to start a virtual relationship to build the foundations of richness if visual media is not available when training remote workers? And the answer is absolutely. Nothing kickstarts a relationship more than spending time with each other. Not only are you getting a physical sense of each other, but there's a lot of social interaction that tells you sense of humor, working style, what you have in common. Oh, your children play football too. That's fabulous. What about this? Oh, you're a Chelsea supporter. I'm so sorry. Whatever it is that helps us work together. Now, is it absolutely mandatory? I would like it to be, but let's face it, if you live in the UK, north to south, it is a much shorter drive than if you have people in New York and people in Los Angeles. I grew up in Canada. It is an ungodly length of time between cities. Driving from place to place half the year, especially in the snow, is not really an option. So you do the best you can. Now, when we talk about visual, this is really important. People assume it automatically means high definition, Cisco telepresence, all that stuff. It can be as simple as showing a picture. I'll give you an example. At the beginning of this meeting, I put a picture of my smiling face up on the screen. Let's see. Come on now. There we go. There's my smiling face. And you can tell from this, I got a little twinkle in my eye. More importantly, my beard is rapidly turning white. I'm not the redheaded young lad I once was. And so I've got some experience. Maybe that gives me some credibility. Maybe you think he seems like a friendly enough guy. But you've got a visual, and that helps you engage with what I'm telling you. So, you know, even pictures of each other allow for a richer experience than just being voices on a phone call. Do you know what Rajesh looks like? Do you know what Cindy's sense of humor? You know, those things are important. Let's see. Your advice suggestions on communicating globally. Oh, okay. So I'm looking at this, and basically, you know, when you've got people who don't have English as a first language, how do you uh, make that work? And the fact of the matter is that richness versus scope is really important in those circumstances. As I say, one of the simple things that leaders can do is open both the audio and the chat. So whenever possible, hold a web meeting as opposed to simply a teleconference. Why does that matter? Well, teleconferences, conference calls, by definition, skew heavily to the motivated and the extroverted. So if I'm sitting there and I want to communicate, and every time I speak up, A, they have a hard time hearing me, and B, especially because I will tell you that North Americans are horrific at translating accents. Every time you speak, you hear, "I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't get it." It's demotivating. You're going to feel foolish. You're not going to feel competent. You're going to stop contributing. But when you stop contributing, your teammates have no idea of the value that you bring. Whereas if your written English is better than your spoken English, the ability to use your chat to edit your input and really create a coherent, valuable thought before contributing makes a big difference. Using asynchronous tools like frequently asked questions and discussion boards and blogs give those people who don't have English as a first language an opportunity to contribute, to offer value to their teammates, to prove their worth to the team. And so that's really important. Webcams are very helpful because often we read lips. If you have a half-decent internet connection, often even if you don't really understand what they said, between their facial expression and kind of lip reading, you can put it together and help each other out. What's important is that when you are in an auditory-only environment, you really, really restrict yourself. And frankly, having teammates translate for each other. If somebody has a point they want to make and they're struggling, if somebody else speaks the same language, very often the ability to quickly speak to each other, and maybe the other person has that ability. So rather than English only, which very often becomes the default, I'm a big believer in letting people kind of hash it out so that their thoughts are coherent, and then translate that to the team. So, a little patience is not a bad plan either. Let me see. So we have plenty of time for other questions. Would absolutely love to make that happen. I'm trying to figure out here. There we go. And Lucy, are there any other questions? What else can we answer, stir up, or otherwise get people thinking about today? Well, if there are no further questions, I would just urge you, please don't be shy. We would love to help you out. Oh, somebody did ask a question here. This is a great one. Do you find the use of webcams is a cultural thing? And it's cultural, and I would suspect not in the way that you think. Culture is simply the way we do things here, right? And there are some cultures, but it's not simply national cultures. Yes, some cultures are more comfortable with the use of webcams than others, but cultures between departments, introverted engineers and salespeople look at webcams, for example, very differently. Age has a huge part of it. If you have grown up in the selfie world, one thing that's really important for those of us of a certain age, read over 45, to recognize is that the younger people in the workplace have grown up with better technology at home than we have at work. And that's never happened before. As I say, I remember when I got my first business email account, and nobody or very few people had home email addresses. You know, now everybody's got one. People come to work, they get assigned their company laptop, and they laugh and they go, "What is this dinosaur? You know, why can't we use our iPhone?" So when we say it's cultural, we need to really be careful. Are we talking about national cultures? Are we talking about work cultures? And the way to overcome the resistance based on culture is to take a look at the results. One of the things when I teach programs, we always use webcams as part of the virtual training. And one of the first things people say is, you know, I didn't think it would make that much of a difference, but it does. The ability to see the other person or the other people. At the end of the day, people want to know who they're communicating with. And so by using webcams in a low-stakes, non-threatening environment, people see the value. And when it comes to technology, people are really good at adopting technology that is easy and that makes their job faster, better, smarter, quicker, more efficient. We are really bad at adopting technology that seems like more trouble than it's worth. And so using webcams as a perfect example every day lowers those barriers to the point where people just figure it out. I mean, the fact of the matter is, pushing the button to start a webcam meeting is exactly as easy as hitting redial on your phone. It's one push of a button. The whole process can be automated. So when they say it's too much work, it's not really. If I'm at my desk and somebody else is at their desk and we have the tool and I push a button and up pops the webcam, it's no more difficult than making a phone call. But it's perceived as being a bigger deal because we haven't gotten the comfort level with it. So, you know, how do you make people feel more comfortable using a webcam? Well, as I said, the first thing is exposure. Lots of exposure. That makes a big difference. The more we use it, the less of a big deal it is. The other thing is to do it when you are not having high stakes. Kevin Eikenberry in the e-learning that we've got talks about the fact that his team got to the point where if he said, oh, we're going to use our webcams, it had to be bad news because he was trying to make it as rich as possible. So you want to just make it part of the process, and that's true of any technology. Let me see here. Somebody asked, do you find the tools discussed have the same value when managing remote call handling teams rather than a creative project team? And the answer is, on some level, yes. Obviously, the ability to use whiteboards and brainstorm is a more critical skill to the way that team works. But I did some work, for example, with Yellow Pages UK, and they had access to a meeting tool, but they never used it. What they found was by being able to see each other, by being able to get on a call with a customer and turn over control of the tool so that the customer could demonstrate something, greatly enhanced engagement and communication. Managers who were able to see when somebody says, I can't do this, you get on a web meeting, you share your screen, you have that person attempt to input the order, and you know what they're doing wrong. If you go back to first principles, what is it we as managers or leaders are trying to do? What are the tools at our disposal? How well do we use those tools? And then are we making it work? And then we can go back to first principles, which is getting the work done. And there's a tool here, and you know, Lucy will tell us a little bit about this. The Remote Leadership Toolkit that we've got is a combination of video and e-learning that really talks about all of these different tools. There's one last question, and I'll turn it back over to you. What's the greatest thing we can do to convince traditional managers to feel more confident about moving towards virtual working? I think there are a couple of things. One is the number one factor in adoption of technology is whether my boss uses it. So if you want your managers to use SharePoint, for example, you as the organization leader need to use SharePoint. You know, I mean, that's just a simple fact. If the bosses don't use it, then obviously it doesn't really matter. Start with first principles. Ask your teams. What we do in how to create and manage remote teams in our virtual class is the first thing we do is we send out pre-work. It's a 3-page assessment that asks, how is your team working? How is it working in terms of task completion? How's the communication on your team? How are the working relationships? And when people say, yeah, we have a problem with that, now they're willing to look for a solution. If you just say, hey, we've got this new tool, people are going to reject it right out of the box. So start with what's working on the team and what do you want to have work better. How can we solve that problem? Technology may well be part of the problem. It may be training. It may not. They may know what they need to do, but they don't have the tools to do it, or they may not have the foggiest clue, in which case that's a soft skills problem. That's got nothing to do with technology. And I think that's really the important point, is that when we think about developing remote leaders, you can't simply think about the soft skills and assume that they will make the transition to doing that mediated through technology, nor can you just look at it as a technology problem. If I'm a manager that avoids conflict, email becomes a really efficient way to avoid having to give bad news. It's a terrible way to coach people. So do you have the leadership mindset to start with, and then how does technology help you enable that? And it needs to start with those first principles. And I think that's probably the message for today is, do your people know those first principles? How well do they exhibit those leadership behaviors? How do you build up those skills? And then how do you help them translate that to this new world of work through these various technologies? So why don't we leave it there, and why don't you tell the fine folks about what Lumess has to offer them?
Thanks very much, Wayne. That was a really interesting session. So yes, as Wayne mentioned, we do have the Remote Leadership Toolkit, which is an off-the-shelf proposition from our partners, Vardo, and there is a 10% discount for any purchases made by September 30th, 2015. So if you have any further questions about the toolkit or would like to find out more about any service that Lumess provide, you can contact us using the details on the screen. Wayne, if you'd be so kind. Also, a recording of this webinar will be made available for you to rewatch or share with any of your colleagues, and a link will be sent around via email in the next sort of 24 hours. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you at another one of our webinars in the near future.